I don't think it's any secret to anyone that everyone loves a story. If you think about it from the youngest age, children just love to have a story read to them. They love the story books. And we would rather hear a story than just strict information that's coming towards us. Well, we just love to hear a story. It's kind of a joke at our house. Janice can't believe how much I enjoy watching the same movies or the same television shows. And I don't know if that's a man thing or what, but I can just watch the same ones. If they're my favorites, I don't care how many times. One day, The Godfather was coming on again, and I just stopped right there and watching The Godfather. She goes, "Are you going to watch The Godfather again?" She said, "How many times are you going to watch The Godfather?" I said, "How many times is it going to come on? That's how many times we're going to watch it," because I just love that story over and over. And I think most people are like that. One of the things that's exciting to me, and you've noticed that Eric and I like to preach in series. We stay in something a month or whatever. I like a series because we get to take our time and just weave our way through and tie that story together. And that's what we're getting to do with our series right now, the story of Ruth. We get to just take 4 weeks and just work through some of the story of that and weave it together, because it is a true story of love and heartache and grief, difficulty, seeing the providence of God, how He just provides for us. We get to see so much of that. And Eric began our series last week and talking about the key players and the circumstances behind that. And it begins with, we're in the Bethlehem area. And there was a man and woman. Naomi was the wife. Elimelech was the husband. And they had 2 sons. And there was a famine, it says, in Bethlehem. And they chose to go to the neighboring country of Moab because things were better there. And we talked about it. That was really a difficult situation because God had spoke against Moab. They were a very evil nation. The things that they had done to the world and to Israel, just very evil people. So God had spoke against, intermingling with them but still that's where Elimelech and Naomi chose to go. And so they end up in Moab, and the 2 sons married 2 Moabite women, and God's still with them. And it says that in time, it says that the 2 sons' wives die, and then Elimelech dies. So they're in Moab, and it's 3 widows. Things change just in those short years. 3 widows living in a foreign land, and it's a man's world. There was, women had so few rights. There was no programs to help a woman. They couldn't just go out and start their own business and such as that. So it was a very difficult time. And Eric said last week, he said, ended up by saying these women are going to have to make some big decisions. And that's what we're talking about today, is that first big decision. Is what are we going to do to survive? 3 widows, and what are they going to do to survive? And Naomi comes up with the plan to move back to Bethlehem because she's heard that things are better there. So she said, we're going to go back to Bethlehem. The 2 daughter-in-laws choose to go with her. And then Naomi, on their trip, she comes to realize, she says, y'all don't need to go with me. You need to stay with your people. And she says this to them in Ruth chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. If you want to begin to turn to Ruth, we're going to spend all of our time there. Ruth chapter 1 and 2. But it says this, then Naomi said to her 2 daughter-in-laws, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown kindness to your dead, talking about her husbands, and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. Now, these three ladies are very close to each other. I mean, they love each other. It says that they cried about it. And if they were willing to leave their homeland to go back with Naomi, it says something about their relationship. But Naomi says, stay here. It'll be better for you. You might meet other men, and I'm not going to have any more children. You might meet somebody and you can marry them. And one of the daughters, Orpah, she decides to return back home. This was before she had her television show. Some of you got that. But she decides to go back home. But Ruth says, no, I want to go with you. Naomi keeps insisting, but this is what it says in Ruth 1, verse 16. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Now, this is probably the most well-known verse out of the whole story of Ruth. And it's honestly it's got to be one of the top known in the Old Testament, because you hear it quoted at weddings and anniversaries and all kind of different things. And this is a tremendous statement of love and dedication and commitment to someone, that you'd be willing to do this. So the two widows, continue their journey on to Bethlehem. But I want you to remember this. Just because they've decided to go back to Bethlehem, it is still a very unsure situation, because there's still two widows going to a land with no jobs, nothing to do. I mean, there's no help waiting for them there. But they make that decision to go where they think they need to be. They're improving their situation, an option to be blessed is what we're going to see. It was time for them to, as I'm saying, turn the page. And that's kind of what I want to think on today, is what this message is about. It's time to turn the page. Turning the page. I think there's a lot we can learn from God in this story, because they're turning the page in their life, and they're positioning themselves to be in God's will, to receive blessings. And we're going to see that so much of that can apply to us. So let's work our way through chapter 2. We're going to stay there the whole time. So if you want to turn in your Bibles there, it'll be on the screen as well. But in Ruth chapter 2, start with verse 1, it says this. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. Now this is just one of those interesting pieces of information that's going to be woven throughout the whole story. This is extremely important, and it lays the groundwork here. It goes on in verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Gleaning is what they call this. This was a process that God had put into place back in the Old Testament book of Leviticus. And I know you were sitting up last night reading Leviticus. But in Leviticus, it's one of those laws that God had set up. It said, when you harvest your grain, when you harvest your crops, when you go through the first time, if you miss some corn or you miss some barley or whatever, don't go back and repick. Leave it. For the widows, the foreigner who may be in our land, don't even go to the corners of your field. Don't get everything. So these people who do not have anything else can at least come in and walk behind and pick these crops. And so you see, God is always trying to look out for the underdog, the one who is the downtrodden. And so he puts into process and a law that it would be there for people to do that. You know, I remember when I came here 35 years ago, they were talking about one of the youth choirs, and I was talking to one of the ladies this morning that was in that youth choir. They wanted to go to Disney World, and one of the things that to raise money, what they did was when they harvested the corn, the youth group went behind and picked up the corn that the harvesters had not gotten, and they filled up trailers with that. And then they sold that, and that's how they raised their money. They said it was as one woman told me this one, she said, that's the hardest money I've ever, hardest work I've ever to get money to go to Disney World, but that was gleaning. What was left behind, people were to take. But you see, Boaz then arrives on the scene. They're harvesting the field. Boaz arrives on the scene, and he says, who is that? I don't recognize this lady. Who is it? And his foreman tells her, he says, that's the woman who came back from Moab. She's a Moabitess. She came back with her mother-in-law, and they've moved here now. And so Boaz goes out to her, to Ruth, and says, hey, the whole time that the harvest is going on, stay here in our fields. Work here. It's safer. I'll make sure that you're safe. Because, see, some farmers resented this very much. It was an Old Testament provision, but there was nobody to enforce it. So there were some farmers who resented that people were getting their grain, their crops. And there were even some who mistreated the widows of the foreigner. You can imagine you planted, you worked, and then a foreigner was in there picking up the leftovers. And they didn't like it. But Boaz said to her, he says, you stay here the whole time of harvest. I'll make sure you're protected, and nobody will take advantage of you here. This action on Boaz's part tells us a whole lot about him. It's called the book of Ruth, but this tells us a lot about Boaz. He was a good man, and he cared about her this much. I love this part here. Ruth says in verse 10, it says, at this, after Boaz had told her all this, at this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. Verse 12, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Isn't that beautiful? And as the workday continues, it goes on and tells us, if you want to read those verses, it tells us that when it got near to the lunchtime, Boaz says to her, you eat with us. You come eat with us. And he gave her so much food that she couldn't eat it all, so she had instant leftovers to carry home to Naomi. He knew that she was taking care of somebody at home as well. He says, you drink from our water pots. And so when she got home and had all of this food from just one day in the fields, she was going, what in the world? Whose field did you work in that you were able to gather this much? And Ruth told her it was a man named Boaz. And this is what Naomi says in verse 20. The Lord bless him. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, he has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead, she added. That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. Now, we're not going to go into what a kinsman redeemer is at this point. That comes in the next 2 weeks. But Naomi recognized this is not a coincidence. This is from the hand of God that you ended up in this field that Boaz, and he's a relative of my husband, my late husband. And she sees it, and she connects it. Well, I think there's some real lessons we can learn from what's taking place here. And I just want to quickly mention 3 quick ones here. And the first one is this. There's nothing better than to be in the center of God's will. There's nothing better to realize that you're living in the center of God's will. They were living in Moab, and we can question Elimelech's decisions that they chose to go there, a place that God had said do not be a part of. But God, being the good God that he is, even when we're far from God, he doesn't abandon us. He didn't give up on us. He's still working in their lives and all the bad things that happened there. He was still working. But they left Moab for a new start. In reality, they were putting themselves in that position for God to bless them. A blessing that would have never happened if they stayed in Moab. Everything we're going to read, none of this would have happened unless they left Moab. And so I think in the physical, they were coming back to where they were supposed to be, but spiritually, they were putting themselves in the place to be. You know, sometimes you have to turn your back on the wrong places in order to get to the right places. Sometimes you got to put those things of the past decisions you've made, and they're wrong. You may be living them in the present, but you got to turn your back on those in order to get to the right places. And during that time, when so many times, and I know some of you have felt this and experienced this, that you make the decision to turn the page, but then it seems like just the bad keeps happening. It just seems like bad things just keep happening. You go, man, what's going on? I made the decision to follow God. I made these changes in my marriage and my family and all these things, and this bad things keep happening. Don't get discouraged. Don't give up. Don't panic. Don't go back, which is so easy to do. Sometimes we have to deal, even though we've turned the page, we still have to deal with some of the consequences of the past. Probably most of you remember that in 2011, March of 2011, there was a 9.1 magnitude earthquake in Southeast Asia. And it caused a tsunami, a giant wave that crashed into Thailand and Japan and those countries. It said some of the waves were 24 feet high. Tremendous amount of damage and destruction and loss of life. But what is so amazing to me, and I remember this happening, 6 months later, the trash and debris that was washed back into the ocean began to arrive on the shores of the west coast of the United States and Canada. Estimated 1.5 million tons of debris began to wash up on our shores. And I tell you that just to say, sometimes things of the past, they're going to wash up on the shore. That you've turned the page, but there's going to be difficulties still because of the decisions and the things that happened in the past. But don't give up. Don't begin to question that following God was a wrong thing to do. Stick to what you've decided to do in the turning of the page. It does not mean you're in the wrong place. I love what it said in verse 12, and we read it, but I want to read it again. It says, Boaz said to Ruth, he says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." God was honoring Ruth through Boaz for what she had done in the past. The good that she was doing, Boaz says, "That's a wonderful thing. I've heard about what you've done. That is tremendous. And I want to be a part of God's blessing to you." And he's so good to Ruth then and providing for her and Naomi. Well, this takes me to the next point. And that's just do the next thing. Do the next right thing. You know, Ruth sitting there with Naomi, they're back to Bethlehem, and she says, "Shouldn't I go out in the fields and begin to work, begin to glean?" And you say, "Well, you better because you want to eat." But she says, she takes the initiative, "Shouldn't I go out?" And she says, "We're back in the land of Israel, but I still need to work." And so she goes out, and she was trying to make things better and take care of herself and Naomi. And God honored that. I love that that the word about Ruth had spread, how good she was being to her mother-in-law. And Boaz hears these things, and God's honoring this. He honors our efforts too. We're not doing it to be rewarded, a good thing, to get a good thing, but when you do the next right thing, whatever that is, when you do it, God honors those choices we make in life, those actions that we have. There's a real lesson here. Our life is going to be defined a lot less by the circumstances that we find ourselves in than the choices that we make. Because all of us are going to have different circumstances. All of us are going to have bad circumstances at one point or another in our life. Some are going to have a lot more than the other. But it's the choices that we make. We either let the circumstances define who we are, or we define ourselves in spite of the circumstances. I read somebody said this week, says, God cannot steer a parked car. So get moving. Keep moving. You may not know what the future is. You may not know what's going to happen. You don't know the decision you're making. Just do the next thing you know to do. Do the next right thing. And trust God that He's going to honor those things, and things will begin to fall in place. Take the next step. And then the last one I want to mention is this. See God in the ordinary. See God in the ordinary. That may be a strange question or a statement. But I want you to think about this. In the book of Ruth, there are no prophets, there are no priests, no kings, no judges, no mention of angels or miracles. It's just ordinary people. Ordinary people doing ordinary things, doing the next thing. And I say that to say that there's so much we can learn and see that God is working in the ordinary circumstances of life, and we may not can see how they're all going to be connected, but God can. He begins to connect these things and to tie them together. One of my favorite verses, and not just Old Testament verse, it's not up on the screen, but it's Micah 6:8. And Micah the prophet saying to people, say, well, what should we do? What should we do next? And he says, God's already told you what to do next. He's already shown you. He says to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with the Lord. He's saying you know what the next thing to do is. So if you're in that position where you know you need to turn a page and you turn the page, but you don't know what's going to happen, just do what you know to do. And start seeing God connect these dots here. Apparently Ruth, even though they were in Moab, a very evil nation, Naomi or Elimelech had taught them to know the God of Israel. Because she says, I want your God to be my God. And she's beginning to believe and connect these things. If she had not gone back to Israel, we'd never hear of Ruth. If she had not gone out to work, we'd never hear. None of this would have happened. If she had not went out and as the foreman said, she's a hard worker. If she had not worked that way. If she had not been a humble worker, because it says she humbly worked in the fields. She was a grateful worker. It says that she bowed down before Boaz and says, why are you blessing me this way? She wasn't arrogant in any way. If she hadn't have cared for Naomi the way she did, then her reputation, the story of Ruth, would not have been told in the community, and then Boaz would have maybe not blessed her as much. If she had not committed to the God of Israel, she wouldn't have bought into his ways. If Boaz had not been a godly businessman and had been resentful and selfish, Boaz would have probably ended up going to another field to work. If he had not been so generous, the things of this story would have not connected together. And as we're going to see next week, if he had not been such an honorable man, none of this would have happened. But all of these things did happen. And nobody knew they were all connected except God. They were all happening because people were doing the right things. And things began to happen. And they end up being blessed beyond measure, anything they could have imagined in a million years. And what I want to say to us today is this: I don't want us to miss those things because we're not. Can you imagine that you miss a great blessing because you're not generous, or you're not thankful, or you don't care about people, or you're not obedient, that you don't go that extra mile? Just think, who knows what God's got planned and in stored But if we don't do those things, we would miss those connections, miss the dots. If you do what everyone else does in the world, if we just do what the rest of the world does, then we're going to get what the rest of the world gets. If we do what the rest of the world does, we're just going to get what the rest of the world gets. And is that what you want for your life? Or do you want more? I believe you want more. I believe God created in us a yearning and a longing to want more in life than just what this world offers. So turn the page. Turn the page. Let it begin today. Do the next right thing. And you know what that is when you're faced with it.